Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakazagawa, and this is episode 127. Today's guest is Maggie Tokuda-Hall. Hello, everyone. Today's show is our latest KTCO Book Club episode, and the book we're covering today is Susanna Clark's 2020 novel Piranesi. And joining us for that conversation is my friend, young adult and children's book author Maggie Tokuda-Hall. Maggie Tokuda-Hall has an MFA in creative writing from USF and a strong cake decorating game. She is the author of the 2017 Parents' Choice Gold Medal winning picture book, Also an Octopus, illustrated by Benji Davis. The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea is her debut young adult novel, which was an NPR Kirkus School Library Journal and Book Page Best Book of 2020. Her new graphic novel, Squad, has already been optioned by Picture Start and Lionsgate for television. She lives in Oakland, California with her husband, son, and objectively perfect dog. Now, I had been meaning to read Piranesi for a while, not only because I loved Clark's first novel, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but also because I'd heard a lot of good things about it from people whose opinions I trust. So I was really happy that Maggie picked this book for our conversation. It's a difficult book to summarize, which we talked about in our conversation. So rather than give you a long blurb up front, I think what I'm going to do is just move into the conversation. Couple of notes before we get started. There is a bookshop.org link in the show notes to purchase a copy of Piranesi, and as usual, I also recommend ordering it from your local independent bookstore. There are also links to the three of Maggie's books I mentioned, as well as her latest children's book, Love in the Library, which is based on the story of how Maggie's grandparents met in the Minidoka Japanese-American incarceration camp during World War II. As you might imagine, that book means a lot to me. Finally, there is a link to Maggie's podcast, Failure to Adapt, in which she and comedian Red Scott talk about media that move from one form to another. It's one of my favorite shows. It's hilarious. I highly recommend it. And if you're looking for a place to start, I'd suggest either the first episode, the Twilight episode with guest Sarah Gailey, or the recent Princess Bride episode with guest Chris Sarandon. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Maggie Tokuda-Hall about Susanna Clark's novel, Piranesi. So I really enjoyed this book a lot. I'm so glad that you suggested it. It's one that I had been meaning to read for a while, ever since it came out. And I'd heard so many good things about it. And I really ended up enjoying it. But I'm curious what it was about this book in particular that made you want to choose this for your talking about.
Yeah, I feel so when I first read it, I loved it so much that I made an offer on Twitter for anyone who wanted to read it. I would do a book club with them. And I had such a large response that I ended up having to do 2 book clubs in 2 weeks, just talking about this book. And both times I was like, we didn't even brush the surface of everything we wanted to talk about. And I just feel like for such a slim book, it offers so much. And so whenever someone's like, hey, do you want to talk about a book in an organized context? This is probably going to be my answer for a little while.
It is a slim book. And, compared to Susanna Clark's first book, which,
Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Yes. I was trying to think of the full title.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
That one is a little bit more of a doorstopper. And
yeah.
Stylistically is very different from this one. That one is sort of in a sort of Regency style. In some ways seems like a very different book, but I kind of feel like there's more that they have in common sort of under the hood than is immediately apparent just when you first start looking at the books. Even just comparing that this is a relatively short novel. I reread the whole thing this morning, and it goes by very quickly if you let it, whereas the other one is, quite a bit longer and more involved. And I know a lot of people reading the first one sort of described it as being very convoluted and sometimes hard to follow, which this one, again, feels different, but there's sort of a similarity of spirit, I feel like. And I was wondering if you felt the same.
Absolutely. I feel like actually they're getting at a lot of the same questions. I feel like Clark talks a lot about academia and the way in which organized knowledge is passed forward. And both of these books have so much to do with that. And I feel like in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, she's coming at it from like a purely British in that period of time kind of point of view, and doesn't really question sort of like the UK's imperialist history in the way that knowledge has been regarded and passed along within their academic history. And this book almost felt like a rebuttal of that framing that she had in her own work for her first book. And plus, they both have these sort of like otherworldly, in-between world, liminal places with the house in Piranesi and in the world that the Fairy King opens in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And so there's like even sort of like setting similarities with these sort of like Escher-like weird spaces where knowledge collects or is hidden or both. And so I don't know. To me, they feel very much by the same person, questioning a lot of the same things at different points in her life.
Yeah. I feel like also there is something in the way each story is framed where stylistically, so this book is presented as an epistolary novel where the whole book is made up of the narrator's journal entries. And although Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell seems a little bit more like a straightforward novel, there's all these footnotes through it that sort of present it in a sort of more, again, sort of academic style.
Yeah, it's written like it's supposed to be a textbook in a way, which is so funny since like I feel like she's kind of poking fun at it at the same time in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Like in its seriousness, it's kind of silly. And in this book, I feel like in what could be the silliness of Piranesi's, or we find out later, Matthew Rose Sorensen's point of view is actually like this very serious undertone. And so it's like the opposite tack for similar effect.
Yeah. The voice in this book is, it's very distinct, and it's something that I just fell in love with. Although it took me a few chapters or so to sort of get it. I feel like, why don't we start with just a general sort of, how would you describe this book to someone if you were going to give them like a, like as from your show, a 30-second overview?
Yeah. Gosh, that's a good question, because I feel like this would be an impossible one to do a 30-second recap of in sort of by design. And I feel like part of the great joy of reading this book is relishing its unfolding. Even in the reread, that was true. And so I guess I would say it's a story about a labyrinth and a person in it. And beyond that, I would start kind of like hemming and hawing and having sort of a hard time narrowing it down. But like a labyrinth as a metaphor for the way that we decode the world, a labyrinth that by definition cannot be solved, and one that is as dangerous as it is kind.
Kind is a word that came up for me a lot when I was reading this book, because it's something that describes the narrator so well, that he has this sort of fundamental kindness to him. And it's interesting because so much of the book plays on his inability to remember things. And there's this sort of central mystery to the plot of the book that revolves around his sort of amnesia,
right,
that he's not even aware of at the beginning. And it would be really easy for the book to view him as sort of a naif, right? As sort of like almost someone to be pitied.
Yeah.
But it really never feels that way to me. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I think if she had, it was a thin line to walk, right? Like she could have easily written him, because we find out throughout the course of reading that like he's a Black man and he's been sort of put there, and the house is sort of like slowly taking away his memories by a white guy, like an academic. And so I think played wrong, written wrong, it could have accidentally played into a lot of sort of like noble, savage, ugly, racist tropes, because he's like decorating his body with seashells and things like that throughout the course of the book. And certainly the man who put him there, the academic who put him there, whose name I just forgot, Dr. Ketterling, has sort of abused him. And I think the reason that it never comes off that way is because not only because of his nobility, of Matthew Rose Sorensen or Piranesi's nobility, but also because of his inescapable intelligence. And one of the things that is apparent right from the beginning is that he knows the house a lot better than Dr. Ketterling does.
Yeah.
Like Ketterling gets scared and lost and doesn't know how to maneuver through it, Whereas Piranesi does. It's this terrifying labyrinth with these tides that wash through the halls that could like easily kill you and do. But because he has sort of figured out how to maneuver through it, he's always safe. And there's even the moment right at the beginning of the book where he's kind of laughing at Dr. Ketterling in his mind. And I don't know, to me, that really made it clear that like, we're not dealing with an idiot.
Right.
Like he might seem simple. He calls, the iPhone that Dr. Ketterling has like his device and he doesn't know how it works or any of these kinds of things. But he's not a stupid person. And there's a lot of care taken to make sure that you know that. And beyond that, he just like, he has the power of reason and like he can deduce things. And even if his deductions are incorrect because he has had, invaluable clues hidden from him, he's a person who thinks with a critical mind, who's creating this large sort of like academic text of his own experience with all these cross-references and an ability to find it again so that he can like access things that he might have forgotten. And that it's just very, very clear. Like if I was put in the house, me, Maggie Tokuda-Hall, an idiot, not only would I be murdered by the tides well within a week, but if I kept a journal, I wouldn't think to have it be so well organized. Like there were so many things where you're like, oh, this is somebody whose mind is expansive as the house that he is being kept in. And I think that that's one of the great strengths of the book.
Yeah. From the very first line of the narrative. So the first line that we get is, when the moon rose in the third northern hall, I went to the ninth vestibule to witness the joining of three tides. Mm-hmm. This is something that happens only once every 8 years. So right in the beginning, from the very, very start of it, it throws us into, at once I found this first line to be kind of confounding because for one, it's got a lot of weird capitalization in it.
Right.
And it's also making reference to a world that we don't know anything about in the first two sentences. But it also demonstrates that especially with that second sentence, this is something that happens only once every 8 years, that this is a character who really, really knows the world that he lives in.
Yeah.
Which is such a fascinating way to start.
Yeah. I have to admit, I had a hard time getting into it the first time I read it. And I think so my husband and I read out loud to each other every night before we go to bed. And this was a book we were reading together. And if we weren't reading it together, I might have kind of given up because the beginning is so disorienting. Like she takes no time or pains to be like, here's where you are. Here's anything to help you understand. She's just like, Piranesi knows his way around and you can follow him. And you're like, what? And that's about as much guidance as you get. And in retrospect, I love that, again, because it's one of those things that highlights his great intellect.
Yeah, it's a really good way of handling sort of the exposition of it all, too, in that normally, if you're a character who just lives in a world, you wouldn't be thinking like, oh, I have to describe this to somebody. But it's really in the first, so the book is in 7 parts, I guess. I think of the journal entries as chapters and then the like table of contents sections as being parts. Mm-hmm. In the first part of the book, it's actually almost all exposition. But somehow it doesn't really feel that way because of this way that she sets him up as sort of an explorer and a scientist describing things.
Yeah.
But also interesting that in this very first chapter, she is setting him up in something that is about as close to an action scene as we get in the book. There are only a few scenes that really feel like action heavy. And this first one is that, where he is describing these tides coming together and he almost gets swept away by the incoming tides, sets up a sort of sense of danger for later in the book.
Yeah.
But also this very first chapter, it just really doesn't explain anything. And it's not until the following 2 or 3 chapters where he sort of describes what the world that he lives in is.
Yeah.
So you're right. It is very disorienting to start with. I certainly found it so on the first read through. But on the second read through, it just feels like it feels a little bit like a big ask of a new reader, but it also just feels like such a skillful way to enter this world. You know what I mean?
I do. And I also think that big asks of readers are not necessary. Like, that's not necessarily a criticism to me. Like, I think that there's something fair Or like, that's an author's prerogative to have a book that's not immediately accessible all the time and to kind of demand a lot of your reader. And, you know, there's obviously the spectrum of that. And I find some of it kind of obnoxious when it's sort of just about harkening back to like, well, have you read these other texts? Mm-hmm. But what I like about hers and the way that she is disorienting is we cannot possibly have the point of reference to not be disoriented by what Piranesi is showing us in the beginning of this book, right? It is not about the education that you have already received, giving you the tools to decode this place. And I feel like that's, again, it's one of the things that makes this book so compelling and also makes sure that she's not sort of living in a Eurocentric understanding of what intellect is throughout the book. Like, I feel like it's one of the things that actually bolstered a lot of the thematic work for me.
Say more about that.
Okay. So for me, this book is so much about colonialism in the way that like this Black body, this Black mind has been captured, being used by a white intellectual, like somebody from academia who also kind of finds him sexually attractive. So there's that element of it as well. And I don't think that you can have that power dynamic without sort of, especially in a British setting, without evoking the colonial history of the UK. And so the fact that we cannot take any of our like clever little notes we might have taken in English class into the beginning of this novel, and we are forced by dint of peculiar setting and the choices she's made to disorient us right off the top to allow Piranesi to be fully our guide and be the only person whose lens we see this through. She's making it clear in some ways that like he is the person with the most access to understanding of the world she's created out of anyone in this book. And that includes a police detective, that includes this British academic, like these people who might otherwise connote authority and who certainly connote whiteness. Like, you cannot depend on them to be your tour guides here. You have to follow Piranesi. And I feel like that's one of the ways that she grants him autonomy, intelligence, nobility, like all of these things that are so often stolen by colonial narratives from Black minds and bodies.
I like the word that you used just there, the phrase you used, tour guide, for a couple of reasons. One, it just feels very apt, especially because the first section of this book, so much of it is him just sort of describing the world that he lives in, which, since we haven't really mentioned it yet, it is sort of this labyrinth of interconnecting halls and what he calls halls and vestibules and stairways and niches and all these different things. Each room that he describes as a hall is covered with all of these statues, and the statues are become this way of this sort of access point for him to understand the world. And as you quickly find out, he's the only one in the world.
The only living person.
Yes. The only living person except for this one other person who he calls the other. And then there are also 13 dead people whose remains he describes in great detail in one of the very early chapters.
The dead people are my favorite. Please go on. Sorry.
This sense of a tour guide is very much sort of how these early chapters read to me, is him describing this to whoever might be reading this journal. It's also something that late in the book, in I think the second to last section, he talks about how he had always sort of imagined meeting a 16th person and what it would be like, and how he could, I think he actually uses the phrase tour guide to describe what he would love to be able to do. And there's a bunch of things in that, one of which is I get this sense that in a lot of ways, because he's talking to this unknown person who's reading his journals, who is us, we are sort of involved in his story. Like he's talking to us. We do get to be the 16th person in that way.
Yeah.
But also what I love about the way that this is done is you get so much of his personality in just the way that he describes the house.
Yeah.
The last line of the first chapter is that he says, "The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite." And throughout the first few chapters, and really throughout the book, you get this sense of not just him describing these things, but describing them in a way that's very revelatory of who he is as a person, which I thought was just really amazing, especially on the second read through.
That's also the last line of the book.
It is.
The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. And I think that it's, again, like a credit to his character, that that's what he takes away from his experience still, is that this place that sort of was his prison for a long time can still represent something so beautiful, this pursuit of knowledge, this like strange otherworldly understanding of the way that knowledge is passed along and collected in sort of like a collective consciousness is so fascinating. And also back to the dead people. Sorry, but I love the dead people. And I especially love the folded up girl. The little girl, she's 7 years old. She's described as being kind of like folded in on herself. You get the impression that she must have passed away, like she'd probably starved to death. And one of his favorite statues is the fawn that's also on the cover, which of course evokes Narnia. Like, of course she's evoking portal fantasy in all of this. And again, I feel like that's part of her sort of like decolonization of the imagination that she's doing this work in this book of. Like, this is not Narnia. This is not the place where you cross into another place and become king by dint of not being from around here. And one of the things that made me so sad, but is also so beautiful, is this idea that like a child did wander into this world and she died. And that's it. There's like no comfort there. There's no silver lining that she provides us to that. It's just, to me, it was to be clear that like the concept of a portal fantasy is in a way a lie that we tell children. And it's a dangerous lie in its way. And I don't know. I really loved it.
I had been sort of wondering, because as the book progresses, you get some insight into who some or all of the dead people are. But I had been wondering about the folded up child, because as far as I could find in both read throughs, there's no mention made by any of the other characters of a child.
Yeah.
So it's just sort of left as a mystery. But it's interesting too, because so I mentioned the first line of the narrative, but the actual first line of the book is the first epigraph, which is from C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew. And as it happens, the other, whose name is Valentine Andrew Ketterly is the magician of The Magician's Nephew as well. So there's a clear Narnia reference there.
Yeah.
And when he describes the fawn statue that you mentioned, the first thing that he says about it, aside from the fact that he loves it so much, is he describes a dream that he had about it, which is a very clear remembering of the first Narnia scene in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Right.
So there's all of these different, I mean, it's interesting to take this in the context of what you were saying before about how your ability to enter this book isn't limited by what you know already, but then there are these little references scattered around through it.
Oh, it's chock full of references. Like Piranesi is the name of an Escher-like Italian architect from like the 1700s or something. Like there's many references within it, but I feel like you can still decode a lot of it without knowing that. Like that can help deepen it, but it's not demanded of you. Does that make sense as a distinction? Because like in one of the groups that I did discussion with, one of the women who was there, Ann Nesbitt, who's a really talented middle grade author, she's also a film scholar. And I don't even remember all the directors she was talking about at this point, but apparently there are like a million references to this one film director from like the early 1900s and his work in it that helped her understand the book that I had zero concept of, and even having it explained to me have since forgotten, and still feel like I have a fulsome experience of this world. And so clearly Susanna Clark is smarter than both of us. But also she's made something where you can approach it with no understanding of any of that and still feel like you had a full meal. And I think that that's a really difficult thing to pull off.
Yeah, it is. I had very much the same experience where a lot of the things that I catch a few references here and there, but some of them I ended up, just trying to look things up, and some of the things that I thought might be references are just to this book. Like the second epigraph is from a fictional character that's in this book.
Yeah.
I was like, who is this epigraph from? So I ended up trying to Google that character and just kept coming back to things about this book, which was sort of a fun experience.
Yeah.
So, okay, I want to move more into the book, but like something that you've said a few times here has really sort of jumped out at me, and I want to just sort of get into that a little bit. Mm-hmm. And one of the word that you used was decoding, mm-hmm. right? Decoding the book.
Yeah.
And I feel like that this idea of decoding the book or sort of figuring it out is really relevant to the way the book is written mm-hmm. in the first place. The first maybe third of the book or so is basically an extended description of the house, this sort of Library of Babel-esque infinite house that the narrator lives in, and a few of his experiences there. It's very evocative. It's very quiet. It feels full of wonder and very resonant, to the point where, like, when I was done with this book in the first time reading through it, it's really this first third of the book or so that stuck with me the most. And at a certain point, so what we learn in sort of midway through this first section is that this other, who he calls the other, his name is actually Dr. Ketterly, is looking for some great knowledge that is some lost form of magic that would allow you to become immortal or do all kinds of amazing things.
Right.
And there's this line that he has, it's on page 60, that I've seen a few other reviewers talk about, where he says, the search for the knowledge has encouraged us to think of the house as if it were a sort of riddle to be unraveled, a text to be interpreted, and that if we ever discover the knowledge, then it will be as if the value has been wrested from the house, and all that remains will be mere scenery. And then shortly later, he says, the house is valuable because it is the house.
Yeah.
It is enough in and of itself. It is not the means to an end. And I feel like this is like the author kind of shouting at us in a certain way, shouting in a really kind of subtle way. That
shouting
maybe...
in a subtle way. Some might call that talking.
Yeah. That treating the book like a puzzle,
yeah,
is in some ways kind of missing the point, even though the structure of the book really encourages you to treat it like a puzzle.
Totally. So I was recently reading this like little zine that John Klassen, Mac Barnett, and Carson Ellis released in conjunction with the book What is Love, that Mac Barnett and Carson Ellis released. And in it, Klassen brings up an interview Cohen did on NPR, in which Cohen was invited on the show and he reads a poem that he had just written. And then the journalist who was hosting it was like, oh, can you tell us what that poem means? And then there's a beat and Cohen just reads the poem over again. And that there is something to be said about sort of like the nobility of art, that sort of like refuses to have a final answer. And I think that's what we have here, is more of like a meditative labyrinth as opposed to a maze. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're not trying to get from point A to point B. The point is to walk along the same path that other people have over and over and over again, and to find new things and to find different vestibules and, like hallways and paths that you hadn't seen before. And so, like, on the one hand, yes, decoding is the best language I have for that, but I don't think that there's like a final answer to this book. And I think that that's one of the things that makes it so satisfying and so ripe for discussion, is that there's clearly things to discuss. There's meaning to be found or to be debated, but it's not like, in the end, here's what Piranesi, the book, means. And I feel like that is sort of mimetic of the way that knowledge functions anyway, the way that our understanding of the world functions. It's not that we come to a final answer, is that there is this beauty in maneuvering through these unknowable spaces and like finding all these different passages and ways and things and never knowing the final overall picture. We'll never have the like bird's eye view schematics of this space, of this way of understanding the world. We never will. and to me, this book made me reflect on that, and also made me feel like that was a thing of beauty, not a thing of hopelessness.
Something that the narrator himself seems very comfortable with in some ways. He goes through these halls and he finds meaning in, like really explicitly finds meaning in all kinds of things, in all kinds of small little details. But ultimately, he seems to be very comfortable with sort of his relationship with this huge sort of numinous, unknowable universe that he lives in.
Right. Like he's not interested in exploiting it. Again,
right.
I'm sorry. I think everything's about decolonizing. I understand that like this is a problem that I bring to the book, but to me that resonates in that way, where it's like he can just appreciate the house as this space, whereas Ketterly is like does not understand it past its potential for benefit for himself. That he actually misses the greatest benefit for himself that it has to offer.
So I mentioned that the way the book is structured is like a puzzle, and it's largely to do with the fact that the narrator is in some significant ways an unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't remember large portions of his own past. The first hint that we get of this is 13 pages in, when he's describing his journals, which you are reading, and we see that, you know, when he's enumerating all of the 10 journals that he has with him, you can see that he switches from normal year numbering starting in the year 2012 to descriptions of years. So the year of weeping and wailing, the year I discovered the coral halls, etc. He even remarks on this when he's looking back over them. He's just like, this seems like really prosaic. Like just numbering them is not very useful. And I don't even know what happened 2,000 years ago that made this worth noting. So I like my new system better. But you get this sense that up until that point, you don't really know anything about the world that you're in. It could be completely fantastic in so far as like having no relationship whatsoever to the world that we know. You really could be in sort of a Library of Babel sort of space where the house really is the whole universe. But here we get our first inklings that there's more going on here than what the narrator is aware of. And the way that she sort of very slowly but deliberately places all of these clues throughout the book until finally leading up to these big revelations late in the book about what has happened to him is, I mean, for one thing, this is like, I think one of the main things people talk about when they talk about this book, how skillfully this is done. It is really, really impressive how the book does this in a way that feels to me at once very sort of slow and parceled out, but also propulsive. And it does it in a way that I feel like leaves the reader feeling really, really smart. But what was your experience? And especially like you as a writer too. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this.
I have to admit, this is one of those books that I didn't even approach as a writer because I feel like what Clark is doing is so beyond my own capabilities that it's a little like beyond even aspirational. Like there's some writers I read and I'm like, oh, I see what they did here and I love that. And when I write, I'm going to try to use some of these similar craft mechanisms. And with Piranesi, I really do feel like it is a novel so beyond my own reach that there was no part of me that was like cribbing notes for craft. There just wasn't. Like, I just can't do this. My mind doesn't work this way. I am not this smart. This is like that taste gap that you hear about between something that you are capable of liking and understanding versus what you are capable of making yourself, being like this vast and terrible gulf. And no book has reminded me of that as profoundly as this one in the last few years. I loved the naming of the years and the way that he handles his journal for a lot of reasons, for the way that it helps us understand Matthew Rose Sorensen. It makes me so sad. The Year of the Weeping and Wailing on the reread really hit me hard, and I just started crying when I saw that because I'd forgotten about it. But that's when you realize, like, that's the year where he realizes, like, he's not escaping. He's stuck here. And it's when he still has a memory of what happened before.
Right. You don't know that until later in the book. He mentions this 13 pages in when you have really no idea of his backstory. And it's not until 2/3 of the book, way through the book, that you actually learn what happened to him.
Yeah. And so when you read it the first time, you're just like, all right, that's a weird name. I'll store it along with all the other fucking weird names you've given me here. This is all weird. And so, like, I don't know. I thought it added to the poetry of the book and my sense of its strangeness. But it also made me reflect on my own life in, like, epochs, like in periods of time a little bit more upon putting it down. And it was like, well, what would I call that period of time? And there are all these other ways of codifying the passage of time that we just don't even bother to entertain because we have our calendar years and that seems sufficient to us. And I liked the invitation to think of time differently, just the way as she thinks of mystery as differently. And this, you know, great, again, like I keep coming back to, like, it takes all these things that I find sort of existentially terrifying, like the fact that we will never know the world, we will never even truly know ourselves. We don't understand so much of what's going on around us. We can never truly understand another person. You know, we'll never have all the knowledge that we could ever have that has been offered in the world. These things that can make you feel so alone and so frightened, the passage of time. And she makes them into something different. The house makes it into something different because the house, you know, is, how does she put it? The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. And that framing is such an invitation for hope that, as like a person prone to depression, as a person who's definitely prone to pessimism and the worst case scenario, and I have the ability to find the sharp edge on fucking anything. I found that really lovely. And I don't think I even understood it necessarily right when I first put the book down, except for that there was that kind of weird feeling in my chest like I was slightly less alone.
It's a book that is, considering the subject matter, is surprisingly gentle.
Yeah.
And just in the same way that that the narrator describes the house as being kind, I feel like the book is as well.
Yeah.
And then another thing here, a lot of the book rests on, the plot of the book rests on this difference in knowledge that we've alluded to here between sort of what the characters call ancient man and modern man. And this idea that one of the characters, who is the one quoted in the first epigraph, Lawrence Arne Sales, describes as people having this more animist view of the world in the past, but that also not being just in people's heads, that in some sense, for example, if they were going to describe a boat on a river, that in some sense the river would be aware of the boat and would be permitting the boat to be there, and also that the world is persuadable. And then this is the foundation of why this labyrinth exists. It's also the foundation of what this great knowledge that Ketterle is looking for. And this is sort of what it's this motivating thing that begins the book in the sort of prehistory of the book, the backstory of the book, what prompts Ketterle to bring the narrator to the house in the first place.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm trying to talk about the plot of this book, but it's really hard.
It's so hard. She's like, she makes it so hard. She's like, oh, you wanted to give a quick little clean summary of my book? Fuck you. And again, it's why like decoding is not the sufficient word for this book. She sort of refuses to let there be any easy answers or any easy summaries. So if I had to summarize, it would be Dr. Ketterle has figured out a way to move into this alternate dimension that is this sort of labyrinthine Escher-esque house. And he has trapped Matthew Rose Sorensen within it for so long that Matthew has forgotten who he is. And Ketterle has renamed him Piranesi purely for his own amusement, definitely referencing the owners of enslaved people who'd give them names like Octavian and the like. And eventually, a police detective starts being able to figure out how to get into this space in looking for Matthew Rose Sorensen. And Piranesi, at that point, thinks that she is a threat, but slowly realizes that she is not. And in her saving him, he also saves her. Ketterly dies. They both go back out into the real world, but the detective has become beguiled by the house, and it's pretty clear that she's probably gonna go back and maybe stay there forever, while simultaneously Matthew Rose Sorensen is sort of learning to live in the normal world again and to maneuver with it with the same hope and sense of beauty that he did through the house. Is that the plot?
It is. And it's funny because like we were saying before, like not a lot actually happens in a way that you could summarize. And the beauty of the book is that like it even though plot wise, the plot is fairly easy to sum up, just telling you what happens in the book, it really doesn't do justice to what the experience of the story is.
Yeah. No. Again, that is not a sufficient explanation of the book, but it's like, man, if I had to summarize the book, that would probably be the best I could do.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I don't know. Even when we were talking and I was thinking about like, oh, it made me feel hopeful. She also is like immediately tells us that there are all these dead bodies trapped in the house.
Mm-hmm.
You know, including the child who just wandered in and probably starved to death because she didn't know how to maneuver through this space the way that Matthew figures out how to. And so even that hope that she might give you is undercut by the fact that it is also a place of human suffering and finality.
Mm-hmm. But even in that, the way that the narrator talks about the dead people is so reverent. His interaction with them, it's almost as if they're not actually dead. He talks to them. He brings them offerings of food, and he brings them decorations. He puts flowers on their bones.
But they're dead.
Yeah.
Like they don't hear that. We don't think.
But who's to say?
I guess that's true. We don't have any evidence that they can hear that or that they in any way benefit from that.
No. And I think there's something to that. He describes this as he makes an offhand comment that that Dr. Ketterly doesn't do anything like this, but as far as he knows, the other has no religious practices.
Right.
So he describes this as his religion.
That's
and
right.
I think there's something to that as well. But also, we do know that, at least insofar as in his conception of the world really does speak to him, that, you know, the meaning that he gets from noticing different statues at different times is meaningful. And it is a way that the house talks to him. The way that birds interact with him. He also talks to the birds.
Yeah. I love the albatross.
Yeah. But he's able to sort of get messages from the world through the actions of these birds, like which statues they end up perching on.
But I mean, okay, sorry, go ahead.
They end up being true also.
That's true. Again, though, I feel like it's not an easy answer. It's not like that he just has this better understanding of the world. It is, to me, that begs the question of like the way that auguring or like religious signs, we will kind of make them feel true. Do you know what I mean? And
yeah.
I like the way that begs the question. It's not necessarily saying I don't feel like the book is necessarily saying that religion is salvation so much as the power of your own mind to assign meaning to things is powerful.
Yeah.
Because his religion's made up, just like all religions are made up. There's no history of it. There's no practice of it before him exactly. He's just sort of doing what feels right to him and somehow feels reverential and spiritual. And so like it feels like it has meaning to him, but just like every other religion, we have no idea if it has any meaning to the world at large, other than the fact that the power of his own belief in it has power.
I feel like this is sort of one of the central questions of the book, because so much of what motivates first the professor and then the other to know about this place at all, whether it's because the other is searching for this magic power that's been lost from the world, or because in the case of the Lawrence Arn Sales is just sort of this sort of megalomaniacal academic figure who really just wants to pump himself up, it seems like. But it rests on this idea that the idea of an animistic universe that ancient man had was not just, I mean, this is something that the book, at least it quotes Lawrence Arn Sales as talking about, that it wasn't just in ancient man's head that this was how the world worked.
Yeah.
And that at some point in history, due to the progress of our understanding, it not only did people stop thinking that was how the world worked, but that the world actually stopped working in that way, and that all the magic went somewhere else. And this labyrinth exists because it's he calls it a distributary world, where it's caused by the leaking of the magic of our world going somewhere else. And I feel like this way of this tension between like sort of our, as the reader, understanding of how the world works and the narrator's understanding of how the world works, it's not answerable, like which one of us is right, or if it's both or neither kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's very present throughout the narrative, especially because everything is told so closely from the narrator's point of view, and he very clearly believes these things, that it becomes very easy because we can see that magic does exist because you're able to get into this other world. But what does that all mean? And what does it mean for how people in the universe of this book, the multiverse of this book, are supposed to understand things, is not really resolved.
Yeah. Yeah, nothing's resolved. She refuses to give us any answers, which, again, this is how I know she's much smarter than I am, because I feel like that's something I'm always trying for, but my own biases always slip through. And I feel like it's an incredible... I have no idea how Susanna Clark feels about the universe from this book. You know? Like, what a feat.
So one of the things that that we've mentioned a few times here is that the narrator is Black. But we don't find this out until 2/3 of the way through the book. And it's actually easy to miss if you're not paying attention. He just happens to mention that his mom is Ghanaian. Yeah. Or he finds this in a bio that he wrote about himself that he happened to copy into his journal.
Right.
And this is something that I found really interesting because, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I first started reading this book through, in the beginning, I wasn't imagining him as Black, which I think says something about how I've been sort of culturally trained to interpret fiction. Yeah,
with white neutrality. Like, if it's neutral, they're white and they're a man.
But it was reminding me of another book that does that keeps the narrator's race hidden until later in the story, except that is Starship Troopers, which doesn't mention that the main character is Filipino until like the last page of the book.
That's because it was written. Okay, sorry. I'll save that for a different day.
Well, I know I know it hasn't been that long since you read and criticized Starship Troopers. And for the listeners, that episode of Failure to Adapt is a lot of fun.
Thank you.
But where in Robert Heinlein doing this feels really sort of reductive and ham-handed and just irritating. It feels different here. I wasn't 100% sure how to feel about this revelation in the beginning, but it does feel really different to me in how it's handled here than how Robert Heinlein handles it.
I mean, Heinlein's using it in like a trite white version understanding of like what a post-racial world means, right? Like to me anyway, because I have very little faith in him and I find him obnoxious. But like, I feel like in Piranesi, the reason we find out so late is because the concept of race as we understand it is a decoding of the world that is irrelevant to the house when he lives there by himself. It's just irrelevant. It's not knowledge that you would need to take forward. It's not the tides. It's not the albatross. It's not the folded up child. And so we only find out later. And I think, the erasure of his entire identity because of his kidnapping, essentially, to me feels too important and too burdened with the history of, Black people's identities being erased by white ownership to be ignored. And so I felt like this was very earned. This was a very different decision than Heinlein's sort of like, I bet you didn't think he was Filipino. Surprise, he is. It's like, all right, shut up, dude. We get it. You think that race doesn't exist, and yet somehow we're still talking about it. Whereas in this book, race absolutely exists, but it does not... it's not in the beginning of the book because that is not the way that Piranesi is decoding his world at that point.
It is, however, and this is something that you don't really get until after this realization, or even until a later reading, that it does very much inflect the way other people treat him.
Yes.
The other, Dr. Ketterly, has this really condescending viewpoint towards him all throughout. He calls him an idiot a few times. And when this is very patently and clearly untrue, that he's not an idiot. He's actually extremely observant, extremely articulate, extremely intelligent. I mean, I think I'm a smart guy, but I don't think I would necessarily be able to write an equation to figure out the flowing of the tides.
Oh, for sure I would not. I don't know about you because I don't know your life, but I would die first. I would die before I was able to do that math.
And even, it's revealed later that the reason that he's even in this place in the first place is because Dr. Ketterly has stolen him.
Yeah.
In order to make him a slave. Would he feel quite so willing to do that to someone who he viewed as his social equal? Maybe not.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a question. This idea of people being stolen first by Lawrence Arnsales and then later by Ketterly and left in this world to die, with one other exception, is an interesting one. And it does seem to revolve a lot around class and existing hierarchies and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely it does. I think you can't ignore that, I feel like, and she doesn't let you. And I think the only other book where I've felt like the race reveal was handled by a white author in a way that I found interesting and smart is actually a really similar narrative in some ways. And it's The Astonishing Life of Octavian Nothing by M.T. Anderson. Have you ever read that?
I haven't.
Okay. Do you mind if I give you a light spoiler?
Sure.
It's actually a pretty big spoiler. I'm sorry. Octavian is a slave and he does not know it. He's being raised in sort of like an intellectual experiment. And he finds out later in his life that that's what's going on. And so when you first start reading the book, you do not understand that you are in Revolutionary era America. And that's something that's sort of slowly revealed over time. And in so doing, you also, Octavian's race is revealed. And God, I hadn't thought about this until this discussion, but in a lot of ways, these two narratives share a lot of structure and DNA in the way that someone highly intelligent and kind and clearly brilliant is an unreliable narrator, not due to their own shortcomings, but to the cruelty of others, is really interesting. Now I want to reread that as a pair to this book. But then that feels weird to center these two white authors. Anyway, anyway, it's an interesting thing that they're both doing. And that book won the National Book Award as well. It wasn't just me who likes it. It was well regarded.
So as we move through this book, as you mentioned, this police detective eventually comes into the world. The other tries to manipulate the narrator into believing that this 16th person is actually evil. And but through a series of events that largely revolves around the narrator rereading his own journals and also finding pieces of his journal that had been excised and putting them back together, learns about what happened in his past, learns about how he was kidnapped. And eventually this all comes to a head just as another large flood happens. There's a scenario where the climactic scene of the book, I'm not 100%
definitely
sure
the climactic scene of the book. You mean the one action sequence with a gun and flooding? Yeah, that's the climactic scene.
Well, the only reason I'm a little unsure whether it should be considered the climax is just because there's still a lot of the book that happens after that.
But after that, it's all resolution, falling action, resolution. We definitely have, for a book that is so quiet and lovely, she definitely gives us one action-packed climactic sequence.
Right. So this all happens. The other, Dr. Ketterly, is in an attempt to try and maintain his control over the situation. He tries to kill both the narrator and the police detective, and ends up getting killed by the flood. And then from there, we have some really touching scenes about the detective bringing the narrator back into our world, but making sure that it's voluntary.
Yeah.
We have what I found a really interesting, especially on the second read, scene of the narrator retrieving Dr. Ketterly's body and very sort of reverently and tenderly interring it with the other dead people that he reveres. And then in the very end, we have the final section where he is back in our world. And a number of things about this I found interesting. The dates go back to being, recognizable dates. The sort of voice changes, certainly the capitalization changes.
Yeah.
And the very last thing that we're left with is this scene where he's out sort of wandering in the world. He sees some people who he recognizes from statues in the house. Mm-hmm. And he's left alone in a snowy courtyard, contemplating the world. And he goes back to that same line that ended the first chapter: the beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. And it's a lovely ending. It's also one that I found a little confounding. But I wanted to see how it struck you.
I mean, it's definitely confounding. I don't think that I came away being like, yes, I definitely feel 100% confident that my reading of this is exactly what Clark intended. But to me, it felt affirming in that way that I kind of keep drifting back to. Inarguably, his life has actually been pretty terrible and pretty traumatic. He was kidnapped in a house where he had to eat fish remains, and his clothes slowly disintegrated, and he had to figure out this tide system lest he be killed for a really long time, and then had to re-enter the world without all of his previous understanding of it and his previous fluency, and kind of relearn how to live here. That is, to me, unquestionably a tragic story. But he comes away from it with this feeling that this pursuit of knowledge, this long labyrinthine walk that he's done, this meditation on knowledge and magic and this secret knowledge that has sort of died away from our world, still is so beautiful and ultimately kind, is so hopeful in a way that I find very difficult to necessarily empathize with, but find intriguing as an aspirational ending.
This, what you were just saying here, touches on something that the way I've been referring to the main character, and I've been referring to him just as the narrator. Mm-hmm. He has a few different names. So the other refers to him as Piranesi. Mm-hmm. The police detective calls him Matthew Rose Sorensen, and this was definitely his name before he was kidnapped.
Yeah.
He refers to himself a few times as Piranesi, but then also always in parentheses he says, but I really don't think that's my name.
Yeah.
And in this final section, he refers to Piranesi and Matthew Rose Sorensen as, he refers to them almost like they're people that are apart from himself. They're not him. And I find this question of the narrator's identity really interesting, and I think in a lot of ways central to the book.
Yeah.
At one point after the climax, when the police detective asks him, you're Matthew Rose Sorensen, and he's talking about Matthew Rose Sorensen as someone that he isn't, even though he has his face and hands and body. And the detective says, and who are you? And his response is, he says something like, I am the beautiful child of the house, or something like that. So this question of what his identity is and how he sees himself as someone separate from both of his past selves is really interesting to me, especially because of the fact that he's Black. And as you mentioned, we can't really separate that from the way that his past is stolen from him in a way that feels very allegorical. But at the same time, something that a lot of other reviewers have talked about is, so the Piranesi name comes out of the fact, most likely this is a name that is kind of cruelly given to him by the other.
Right.
Because this artist, Piranesi, was known for these engravings that he made of imaginary prisons that a lot of people see as being something that influenced Escher's drawings later.
Right.
But that the narrator never sees his prison as a prison. It's his home and he loves it.
Yeah.
So there's this whole thing about, his identity has been stolen from him, but he doesn't see it that way.
Well, he doesn't see it once his entire memory of himself has been erased. So like on the one hand, yes, like he does not see it that way, but also he's an unreliable narrator of his own life because so much of it is missing. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Again, no easy answer. Like it's not, I struggle with what to call him too, because Piranesi is clearly not the name he would like to be called. Like that's not what he names himself. And I think part of that is sort of a rejection of the idea that he's imprisoned. Mm-hmm. But I think that it is also impossible to ignore that he has been imprisoned. Yeah. So like, again, just like everything else in the book, there's not like a simple way to read it because he's had so much of his own sense of self erased that I wonder what he would say years and years and years after being out of the house.
Yeah. It's tough too, because not only is the way that he views the house, the labyrinth, very beautiful and very comforting even. Mm-hmm. But when he comes back to our world, the way that he views certain aspects of it with a clarity that is interesting, I find, and even like kind of funny in some ways. Like there's a little dig that he makes at capitalism, like, why do I have to pay you money for this? You have a thing I need, and then someday I might have a thing that you need and I'll just give it to you.
Yeah.
There's this thing about him that's established all through the book where he kind of looks at things for what they are in ways that other people don't.
Yeah.
He is able to see all of the details and what makes each room, each statue special and different and unique in ways that Ketterle is not. He brings this sort of similar sense of looking at our world in ways that are sort of touched on a little bit in this final section. So it's a little, I don't know, this innocence that he has, you could see it as like something that enables him to see things more clearly, but at what cost did that come?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good way of sort of summing it up, where it's like, yes, inside of a vacuum, we could understand the world in this particular way, but at what cost would it be to exist in a vacuum? Yeah. And ultimately, he can't. That's not sustainable in the world of this novel anyway.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too that, so this police detective becomes obviously enamored of the labyrinth, and he makes references to her continuing to visit there, and he says, but I'm not, don't disappear, because we can't keep rescuing each other. That would just be ridiculous.
Yeah.
And he also says that she is the person that he knows and loves the best.
Yeah.
So there's clearly this important friendship relationship type of thing that grows between him and this detective, and it's important to him and I think to the reader. But the last thing that we're left with is him alone again. And I know that this book was written over a long period of time. I'm tempted to read this because there's so much isolation in my own life and in everyone's life over the past 2 years, to read this inflected by the pandemic. And obviously we can't really do that with this book.
Right.
But I don't know, there's just something about the way that he begins and ends this book alone that feels really significant to me, Just
like we are born and die alone.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, like it's sort of trite, but I do think that it's also true. Like ultimately we are alone with our brain meats, right?
Yeah.
That's it. And
he is so at peace with that though.
Yes, because he's been alone for so long. And so that's not frightening.
Yeah.
Whereas for most of us, that's like a death sentence. And it's hard not to project that onto him. Yeah. But he's been alone and found this incredible dignity and hope and beauty in the world. that being said, though, he's also telling the detective not to do that. And so there is some part of him that knows that like, that's not quite right either. And I think it's particularly enticing to somebody who is, she's like a good detective. She's the platonic ideal of what a detective would be, a person who's confronted with a mystery and is unable to rest until she solves it, regardless of circumstance and regardless of whether or not other people think that, you know, this is a mystery that matters. And so, of course, the labyrinth is going to be so enticing and beguiling to her specifically that to me, I can't read the ending and think that she's not going to get lost in there. Like, to me, that's going to happen. And he's tried to warn her, but that's it. Like, that is what's going to happen in my reading of it. And he knows that's not good.
Yeah. We certainly get the impression that there's something about the solitude of it that is appealing to her.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what, like, we can't really do more to sum up this book. But we are getting pretty close to time.
Yeah.
So the last question that I always end these episodes with is if there is another piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yeah. It wasn't super recently that I read it, but it was the other book that I suggested for discussion in this podcast that I thought would be really fun to talk about with you was Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. It's definitely my favorite book I read in 2021. It's another book where the author makes no effort to explain the world to you, but you're not in our world. And I thought it was so beautiful and so affecting the way that it illuminates sort of like the quiet, like moments of nobility in everyday life that often are the moments that make us love someone or remember someone or make something resonant that are not necessarily, you know, big moments of action or climax or whatever. And so I thought that book is so beautiful. And then on the completely other end of the spectrum, there is a podcast called Normal Gossip that is just petty gossip. The host recounts an anonymously sourced story every episode, and she has different guests on. The guests are all hilarious. And it's like just the goofiest, lowest stakes, human bullshit, gasp gossip that like, I love it. And I highly recommend it for when you're like, I don't want to learn anything. I don't want to be a better person right now. I just want to like lean in to feeling like a stupid idiot who likes to gossip. And it's like actually a very smart version of that. I really enjoy it. I think she curates it exceptionally well. In lesser hands, it could be a really mean-spirited podcast, and it's not.
Nice.
Yeah. How about you?
Right, well, how about me? I am currently reading, and this will be the subject of a future episode, I'm reading a short story collection, which is called Friday Black by Nana Ajay Brenya. And it's all written in a voice that's very heightened, and it's largely about sort of really heightened to the point of ridiculousness stories about being Black in America in ways that are horrifying, also sort of darkly funny. And I'm really looking forward to getting to talk about that book. It is kind of brutal in some places, and it really straddles the line between sort of realistic and speculative fiction with, you know, like, is it speculative? Is it satire? Is it, I'm not exactly sure how to classify it, but it's not like anything else I've read, certainly not recently. So,
yeah.
All right. And, you know, another, if we're going to talk about podcasts, another one that I have enjoyed quite a lot recently is Failure to Adapt, which I'm sure people can find all about.
Yeah, we're coming back for
you get your podcasts.
Yeah, we're coming back for season 2 in like 2 weeks. I'm so excited. We have a bunch of episodes banked, and some of them are bangers.
Nice.
So I should say they're all bangers. We got some very fancy guests this season, and I'm pretty proud of us. So
cool. Well, I look forward to it.
Thanks.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes where you can purchase copies of Piranesi, as well as all of Maggie's books. There's also a link to Failure to Adapt, which you can find in your podcatcher of choice. I highly recommend all of them. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, I would so love it if you left a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are handy links in the show notes for that, and if you use them, then you can go to bed tonight knowing that you have put a smile on my face and a spring in my step. You can find all of the rest of the show's social media information, email newsletter, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechanneleopen.com. We'll be back on April 27th with a conversation with professor and critic Anahid Nersessian about her book Keats's Odes, A Lover's Discourse, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.